Part 5 of Beyond Good and Evil begins with section 186, in which Nietzsche describes his project and contrasts it with the projects of past moral philosophers. Nietzsche will, he says, produce a descriptive typology of morals. Past philosophers have attempted something quite different. They have tried to find a rational foundation for morals. This quest for a rational foundation took the existence of morality and moral obligation for granted. Thus, the moral philosophers of the past ignored the descriptive task as trivial and unimportant. On the contrary, writes Nietzsche, constructing a typology of morals requires the greatest subtlety. Note that here Nietzsche contrasts his subtle psychological observation with the clumsy moralizing that has passed for philosophy up to now. The problem with past moral philosophy, writes Nietzsche, is that it has not yet confronted the real problems of morality. Because they ignored the descriptive task in favor of inquiry into rational foundations, these philosophers' knowledge of morals was only approximate and arbitrary. They did not study the moralities of different peoples and past ages. The real problems of morality can only be seen by a comparison of many different moralities. Past scholars' claimed rational foundations of morals are nothing more than disguised faith in the dominant moral code of their place and time. Think especially of Kant in this regard. Thus, these philosophers assume that there is and can be no real problem with morality as such. Nietzsche's task, by contrast, is the analysis, examination, and vivisection, or live dissection, of this faith in moral obligation. He concludes this section with an example. Schopenhauer, the famous pessimist, talks like a child or a pious old woman when he says that hurt no one is a universal moral precept. Nietzsche replies, "Whoever has once felt deeply how insipidly false and sentimental this principle is in a world whose essence is will to power, should recall that Schopenhauer, for all his claimed pessimism, played the flute every day after dinner." Nietzsche here suggests that although Schopenhauer repudiates belief in God, he is not willing to abandon belief in a universal do-no-harm morality. Is he really a pessimist, then? Asks Nietzsche. Note that in attacking Schopenhauer as a sentimentalist, Nietzsche appeals to his readers' deep feeling that the no-harm principle is ridiculous and false, since the world is run by will to power. He does not appeal to a rational principle so much as to the shared intuition of how things are. He appeals to a prior acceptance of the reality of will to power in order to dismiss Schopenhauer. Where does this acceptance come from? Why should we, as Nietzsche's readers, share it? What is its foundation? These are questions we should keep in mind as we continue to read the work. That's my summary of and commentary on section 186 of Beyond Good and Evil. Sections 187 and 188 of Beyond Good and Evil have a common theme: obedience. In section 187, Nietzsche notes that a philosopher's moral claims reveal his personal psychological profile. Again, think of Kant, whose categorical imperative tells us as much about Kant's personality as about moral obligation. Additionally, writes Nietzsche, moral systems often attempt a task such as public justification, revenge, concealment, or self-transcendence. Nietzsche concludes this short section with another observation about Kant. His morality says, "My ability to obey is valuable. You should be like me." Thus, Nietzsche writes, moralities are also merely a sign language of the affects, or emotions. Note that Nietzsche here discusses moralities in the plural rather than morality, singular. He is giving a natural history of past philosophers' moral codes, considered independently of their truth. Also note that, for Nietzsche, each moral code reveals its author's emotional life and psychology, his will to power. We may ask, Does this pattern include Nietzsche's ruminations on morality here in this work? Section 188 continues on the theme of obedience and discipline. Every morality is a bit of tyranny, a long compulsion, that is, a self-discipline, rather than a letting alone. All freedom, all culture, Nietzsche writes, depend on seemingly arbitrary laws and restraints. Working under restraint is what is natural to man, contrary to Rousseau's and others' celebration of natural freedom. Artists in particular know that letting alone is deadly to art. One must obey in order to create. We may think here of how the strictures of the sonnet form enabled Shakespeare to produce poems of lasting beauty. Such greatness does not come through free verse. All worthwhile things are the result of sustained obedience, Nietzsche tells us. The long unfreedom of discipline under ancient and Christian systems of thought has generated strength in the European spirit. This was so even as such discipline crushed and stifled other movements of the human spirit. Here, as in Darwinian biology, nature is wasteful. The capricious tyranny of Christianity, interpreting all experiences in the framework of divine care and action, has disciplined the European spirit, says Nietzsche. Such mental slavery is an indispensable means of spiritual growth. Every morality requires discipline, narrowed horizons, the tightening of possibilities rather than their opening, that is, letting alone. In a certain sense, stupidity is a condition for life and growth. You shall obey is an imperative addressed not to individuals, but to peoples, races, classes, to mankind itself. In these thoughts on obedience, Nietzsche makes it clear that he is against a certain type of freedom, the type he associates with utilitarians and the last man. Ever-increasing freedom from restraint, letting each individual will go to satisfy its own desires, whatever they may be. Rather, he insists on the need for constraint, rules, and self-discipline. Laxity with oneself means spiritual decline, the path to the last man. Nietzsche is searching for a post-Christian discipline, and he will not find it in democratic politics, nor in the remnants of modernist religion. It will come ultimately from the will to power, as we will see later in the work. That's my summary of and commentary on sections 187 and 188 of Beyond Good and Evil. In the middle sections of Part 5 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche continues his natural history of morals and introduces several aspects of what he will later call slave morality. In section 189, he notes that the industrious races of the earth, thinking especially here of the English, find leisure hard to bear. Being idle, taking leisure, is a burden for them. And he notes that it's the special genius of the English to have made the Sabbath so boring that the Englishman looks forward to its ending so he can get back to work, so he can resume doing something useful. Nietzsche also observes here that constraint and the religious discipline of fasting can help to purify and sharpen a natural drive. And as Kaufmann observes in the footnote, Nietzsche is the first to use the word sublimate in the sense that Freud would later make famous. The next two sections deal with Plato and Socrates, and as we know from other works, Nietzsche's judgment of Socrates is somewhat complicated. In section 190, Nietzsche suggests that the noble Plato may be somewhat ashamed of his lingering Socratism. He does the best he can with it, but it is a kind of lingering or leftover legacy of something that really is beneath him intellectually and in a character sense. Nietzsche is thinking here especially of the doctrine that no one does wrong willingly. This he associates with the rabble, with a kind of herd instinct utilitarianism that assumes that bad actions are just actions that have bad consequences, and conversely, that good actions are actions that are useful and agreeable, that have beneficial results. We can recognize here
some of the vocabulary of slave morality. These are the terms of evil and good that we'll see explored more fully in section 260. In section 191, Nietzsche discusses Plato versus Socrates on the question of instinct and rationality in moral valuations. Plato, being the simpler and more naive of the two, holds that reason and instinct generally converge on the good and on God, and Nietzsche says that all Christian theologians have followed Plato down this path, and thus the herd, Nietzsche's term, the herd has triumphed. Socrates, he says, is more subtle in his evaluation of instinct in its role in morality. Socrates initially sided with reason, but then came to recognize the instinctive element in moral judgments. And he concluded that one should follow the instincts but persuade reason to assist them with good reasons. And I wonder if this might be a possible model for Nietzsche's philosophy, in the sense that Platonic and Christian morals are regnant, but a more subtle philosopher, Nietzsche or perhaps Socrates, sees the deeper reality beneath these things, but does this in a kind of ironic way. Section 192, Nietzsche observes that across the board we rely on our own assumptions, imagination, and simulations, rather than on a strictly empirical seeing what is there. He applies this to perception, to social psychology, and even to science. We see what we expect to see in all these fields. And Nietzsche says, one is much more of an artist than one knows. I think we might extend this insight by applying it to the idea of self-knowledge. Think of the self knowing itself as self-creating, as the author of its own self. We have here the idea of a self as a work of art that might be characteristic of some later existential thinkers. In section 195, Nietzsche notes that the ancient Jews worked this first inversion of values with world-changing results. They rolled together the concepts of rich, godless, violent, and sensuous into a concept of evil, and their opposites, poor, holy, harmless, and spiritual, are likewise combined into a concept which we'll see later called good. And this, he says, is the beginning of the slave rebellion in morals, this past revaluation of values that Nietzsche intends to undo later on. In section 196, Nietzsche merely observes that in astronomy we can infer the existence of dark stellar bodies by their effect on observable ones. And this is a kind of model for Nietzsche's moral analysis. He will come to the conclusion about things that we cannot observe and see on the basis of their effects on what we do see in the behavior and the moral valuations of historical peoples and of our own time. Sections 197 and 198 are marked by Nietzsche as going towards a chapter to be called Morality as Timidity. In 197, he says, it would be a mistake for us to see a man of prey, a man like Cesare Borgia, as pathological, and to look for the damage or the break that is inside of him. This, he says, is the judgment of mediocre men. And in 198, he notes that prior moralities of individual happiness make the mistake of generalizing inappropriately. They try to generalize over the whole human race. He refers here specifically to the Stoics, to Spinoza, and even to Aristotle. These are moralities that try to give us unconditional or universal rules. Nietzsche's judgment on this is quite harsh. He calls it prudence, prudence, prudence mixed with stupidity, stupidity, stupidity. That takes us through section 198, which sets us up for the final sections of part 5, a further introduction to slave morality. We'll talk about those in the next video.
The final 5 sections of Part 5 of Beyond Good and Evil are important and should be read carefully. Before we begin, I'd like to say a word or two about Nietzsche's Lamarckism. Lamarckism is a pre-Darwinian, pre-Mendelian belief that changes that an individual acquires through purposive behavior can somehow be passed on to future generations. The difficulty with Lamarckism is that it is undeniably false. It is simply not a viable biological theory any longer. So a question to think about as we read what Nietzsche is saying in these sections is whether any of his claims or insights can be separated from his Lamarckian assumptions. Can we reinterpret some of his claims in a psychological or sociological framework, for example? Now, on to Nietzsche's text. In section 199, he says that human societies have always consisted of herds, with many who obey and relatively few who command, and that over time this need for obedience is now innate in many human beings. And this produces what he calls a formal conscience, a kind of structural conscience, which simply says thou shalt or thou shalt not, with a blank at the end, thou shalt blank, thou shalt do something. These are always phrased in terms of unconditional and impersonal commands, but they require content. The content, says Nietzsche, is always provided by something like instinct or public opinion, class prejudice, or generally any loud voice that can impress a certain content upon the formal conscience of the herd individual. Human history and its progress and lack of progress, he says, can be explained by the fact that the herd instinct is more readily inherited than the command instinct. And so the logical end of all this process is that the commanders gradually die out, or they suffer from guilty conscience. They end up having to deceive themselves in order to command. They have to pretend that they obey even while they are commanding. This is the situation that actually exists in Europe today, says Nietzsche, today for him being 1886. He calls this the moral hypocrisy of the commanders. They need to deceive themselves in order to command. They need to pretend that they also are obeyers, obeying some kind of higher command, either commands of objective morality or of divine will. And I think it's important to note that Nietzsche's claim here is that these commanders are doing this in order to salve their own guilty conscience. That is, this is psychological and not cynical. They are not pretending to obey in order to manipulate people. They are pretending to obey because they are psychologically incapable of commanding unambiguously and in a sort of unconcealed way. This is the lie they have to tell to themselves in order to live out their life as commanders. The herd man today claims to be the only acceptable type of man, says Nietzsche, and therefore he glorifies his own traits as universally good. What makes a good herd man is what is good for all human beings. And yet, he says, the appearance of a genuine, unconditional commander, a man like Napoleon, fills them with relief because it promises to relieve the intolerable pressure that is building up within them. This is part of Nietzsche's psychological analysis of the herd man. Because of the mixed heritage of modern man, individuals contain many conflicting drives and values. There's a tremendous tumult and opposition within each individual. And this produces, generally, weaker human types, which, above all, desire to end this inner conflict, to end the war that they are, that's sort of written into their very psychology. And this type of man then tends to think of happiness as a kind of tranquility, a tranquilization, a coming to rest and arriving at an end to the inner strife and tumult of their own being. But he says in late ages there also appear these very rare exceptional types, men possessed of self-mastery and self-outwitting. These are these enigmatic men of destiny. He names Alcibiades, Julius Caesar, and Leonardo da Vinci as three possible types, and notes that these darers of great things also originate from the same inner war that produces the weak and herd type of man. These always appear simultaneously. We might think here of whether he is speaking of something like the overman that he described in Zarathustra. Nietzsche makes two major points in section 201. First, that in the life of the herd, love of neighbor is always secondary to and consequent upon fear of neighbor. This is because the safety of the community requires labeling anything strong and dangerous in the human person as immoral. And second, strong exceptional individuals threaten the herd. These can be men of high spirituality, of strong will, even of strong reason. These are seen as dangerous and labeled evil by the herd, which instead praises itself and praises the harmless mediocrity of people who don't threaten the common good. But without opportunities of strong spirits to educate themselves in severity, the noble spirit can decline and die out. And so we might see a soft society beginning to side with the criminals who would destroy it. And they do this in all sincerity, says Nietzsche. They have come to see inflicting punishment in itself as being terrifying and burdensome. They would much rather not do it. They would satisfy themselves with merely making criminals harmless, that is, harmless to the herd, to the common good. And this, he says again, is the situation of Europe today. This herd timidity that wants nothing more than to abolish danger. But to abolish danger is also to abolish herd morality, the morality of minimizing and avoiding danger. And this is what the herd calls progress. We might think here for a moment about the future that Nietzsche is describing. If herd morality is the only possible morality, and it aims towards abolishing danger, but that also means abolishing itself, this means that this herd morality is moving mankind toward a situation in which there will be no more morality at all. Human beings will be completely safe from all danger, and therefore there'll be no need for any moral categories or any moral judgments at all. This is a danger that Nietzsche is warning against, and something that he wishes to avoid. Now, some may object to the herd label, Nietzsche says, to this animalization of human beings in his description, but he says this is correct. All of Europe today, in 1886, thinks with one mind in its moral judgments. They all think in terms of good and evil. And this amounts to the self-glorification of the herd instinct and the confirmation of its dominance over all other human instincts and all other human possibilities. Nietzsche's key point in this section is that there exist other moralities besides herd morality. They have existed in the past and in the present and can again in the future. Now, herd morality denies this and insists that it is the only possible type of morality, and it is supported in this claim by Christianity and democracy. And even this dominance is not enough for some, says Nietzsche. We witness then the anarchists and the socialists and the complete egalitarians who wish to go farther. What we have, he says, is a shared culture of softness, pity, and hatred of suffering, hatred of punishment. But this faith in community is glorifying the herd. It's a sort of self-glorification of the herd man. In the final section of Part 5, section 203, Nietzsche begins to sketch out his own alternative. He notes that democracy is a continuation of this long decline of European man. Our hope, he says, is in the new philosophers, in spirits that are strong and original enough to invert herd morality, to create a new morality of the will that goes beyond the herd morality's categories of good and evil, hence the title of the book. He calls for a revaluation of values under whose new pressure and hammer a conscience would be steeled, a heart turned to bronze in order to endure the weight of such responsibility. Such new philosophers will be far greater and more terrifying than the best men of today. We might think again here of the Overman. And the hope for such leaders, and the fear that they may not come, or that they may be lost or corrupted or become decadent, this generates great anxiety in Nietzsche. But the alternative to this is the completion of this herd morality conversion of man into just another animal, a kind of dwarf animal. And this provokes an even stronger reaction of nausea in Nietzsche. So with Nietzsche's anxiety and with his nausea, we conclude Book 5. We'll look at Book 6 next. Part 6 of Beyond Good and Evil is 10 sections long and covers about 20 pages in the Kaufman translation. Its main focus is the character of today's modern philosophers and the character of the coming philosopher of the future. Nietzsche diagnoses a harmful shift in philosophy, a dangerous neglect of experience. Scholars are declaring independence of all hierarchies, but this amounts in their case to a kind of self-glorification, such that the scientific men are now trying to dictate to philosophy itself. There is a general atmosphere of contempt and lack of respect for philosophy, which Nietzsche thinks has opened the gate for the instinct of the rabble to enter the halls of philosophy. He especially indicts the positivists, positivism as a kind of lack of belief in philosophy itself, and notes that modern philosophy has fallen very far Now, as mere epistemology, as theory of knowledge only, it possesses no dominating spirit. It cannot serve as the engine or driver of any new culture or any new creation of values, any new synthetic view of the world. He refers to philosophers who overspecialize as dilettantes or millipedes, and he argues that philosophers should be giving a strong yes or no to life and to the value of life, and that by the standards of today, the genuine philosopher will seem to be imprudent to take wild risks with himself. Today's scholars, Nietzsche says, have traded fruitfulness for respectability, and so they have all the virtues of this type of person, industriousness, a patient acceptance of their position in life, along with a moderation and sensitivity to the needs of their equals, of their class of mediocre people. He notes that this type of scholar profoundly wants an affirmation of his own value and his utility, a sort of constant reminder or refresher of the social usefulness of his work. Nietzsche says this is a remedy for a psychological defect, for this kind of self-mistrust which infects this mediocre sort of soul. These people also possess the vices of their class, a kind of petty envy or familiarity, and finally, a cold-eyed resentment which finds expression in an attempt to annihilate or pull down whatever is exceptional, whatever stands above the mediocre. Nietzsche has some critical words for the objective spirit in philosophy and in scholarship. The purely objective man, to the extent that he realizes his ideal, becomes a kind of mirror. He empties himself completely and simply reflects whatever is in front of him. He submits himself to the reality that he is studying, and in doing this, he minimizes himself and his own role in the entire project of knowing. There is little love and little hatred in him. He has become an instrument rather than a philosopher, and so he cannot be an engine of culture, of value creation. He's not a goal. He has, in a sense, lost himself in his pursuit of this style of objective scholarship. Philosophers who reject skepticism are received with a kind of horror by the scholars of today, says Nietzsche, who see skepticism as a necessary corrective against the forces of nihilism and are very concerned about anyone who breaks with this party line. The skeptic, says Nietzsche, is a kind of delicate creature who flinches at anyone who says yes or no too forcefully. Of course, that is Nietzsche and the Nietzschean philosopher of the future that he's thinking of there. Nietzsche diagnoses this attraction to skepticism as the spiritual effect of a kind of physiological nervous exhaustion, which he thinks is a reaction to this long-time mixing of values and lineages in the European consciousness. The will gradually atrophies, and these scholars, skeptical scholars, take no pleasure in willing. Nietzsche observes that this is not a geographically evenly spread phenomenon, that this particular kind of atrophy is most advanced in France, least advanced in Russia. He speaks a bit about national characters here and suggests that the 20th century will bring a fight for the dominion over the earth between these different nations that have these different levels of atrophy of spirit. Nietzsche also praises, by contrast, the spiritualized skepticism of the Emperor Frederick the Great. In the final sections of Part 6, Nietzsche turns towards describing the character of this philosopher of the future, which he's referred to throughout this work. The philosopher of the future will be a critic. He will be an experimenter, an attempter of new things, focused upon experience. He will have a certain kind of level-headed cruelty. He will seem to be harder than his contemporaries, and he will wield a subtle knife. He will be disciplined and severe with himself. Nietzsche notes that there is an element of critique or criticism in this type of philosophy, but it is an instrument rather than being the whole of philosophy, and he specifically names here Kant as the one he is contrasting this system with. Nietzsche contrasts genuine philosophers with what he calls philosophical laborers. The genuine philosopher works to create values out of his will to power. He has this sort of higher synthesis that he is trying to achieve. Philosophical laborers
men, especially like Kant, are mere instruments for the genuine philosophers to accomplish their task. They lack ambition in a certain sense. The genuine philosopher, whom Nietzsche says will be a man of tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, practices an intellectual vivisection of the values of today. He cuts these things apart while they are alive. He diagnoses the moral psychology of his contemporaries in order to uncover a new greatness in man. And he finds this greatness in his own range and multiplicity and the strength of his will. The identity of a philosopher, Nietzsche says, cannot be taught but must be learned from experience. One cannot be trained into this, one must discover it. Modern philosophers have fallen into the trap of regarding thought as a kind of toilsome work, as something grave and serious, rather than something light-hearted, something like dancing. There is an order of rank among the different states of the soul, Nietzsche says in conclusion, and it's one's place in this order of rank that determines the problems that one can confront. The genuine philosopher, the philosopher of the future, will be the result of many generations' worth of preparation. And here, perhaps again, we see a return of Nietzsche's Lamarckism. That brings us to the end of Part 6 of Beyond Good and Evil. We'll talk about Part 7 next.
Part 7 of Beyond Good and Evil is about 25 pages long. It runs from section 214 to section 239. The final third of this part covers Nietzsche's thoughts on women. I'll discuss those in a separate video. Let's begin with the title. The title of Part 7 is Our Virtues. We should remember that this follows Part 6, titled We Scholars, so we can imagine that Nietzsche here is addressing his allies and also sketching out the character of this new type of philosopher, this new philosopher of the future, the type of person he will refer to at the beginning of this part as the firstborn of the 20th century. We should also remember throughout this part that for Nietzsche, all philosophy is personal. A philosopher's thought reveals some important element of his character or psyche. We'll return to that theme over and over again throughout Part 7 and beyond. In section 214, Nietzsche names some of these virtues of the philosophers of the future: a dangerous curiosity, a certain art of multiplicity and disguise, and a kind of mellow cruelty, he says, characterize us, we new generation of scholars. The only virtues we will have, he says, are the virtues that agree with our needs, with our own inner inclinations. Again, this theme that philosophy is intensely personal. We would search for our virtues, Nietzsche says, in the labyrinth of ourselves, raises an interesting prospect of interior study, not as a source of illumination, but as a kind of searching through a labyrinth for a way through. So one looks for one's own virtues through self-exploration, through interior reflection. And this serves in some way as a replacement for a good conscience, which might have characterized a previous generation of philosopher. Nietzsche ends section 214 by promising that very soon all will be different. And I think he means by this that we new philosophers may seem similar to the old ones in our interiority, but just wait. The product, the end result of this reflection will be quite different in character. Section 215 is quite short, and it begins with an astronomical metaphor. Nietzsche discusses the orbit of planets in a double star system. If there are two stars, a planet might orbit in response to the gravitational pull of each of its different suns, and he says we moderns are like planets. Our orbits are shaped, he says, by multiple moralities. So we might feel the pull of several different moral centers of gravity, and we wobble along in our orbit under that influence. He also uses the metaphor of planets illuminated by different colors of light from different stars, so we can imagine an object seen differently in different moral lights, depending upon whether the sun of our dominant morality is casting red or green light, so to speak. The phenomenon itself is the same, but illuminated differently, it appears quite different. I think this section, short as it is, raises one of Nietzsche's key themes, which is the replacement of a single universal morality with multiple moralities, like the multiple suns of this imagined star system. Section 216 begins discussing the injunction to love one's enemies, and Nietzsche plays that into an idea that one often comes to despise what one loves, and frequently this happens unconsciously. We see Nietzsche, the psychologist, working here. He mentions briefly that morality as a pose, a kind of insincere front, is offensive to our taste today. Yet, he says, this is progress. This is the next step after the way in which religion came to offend Voltaire's taste in his time. This is what, he says, separates our generation of philosophers from the old Puritanism and the like. Section 217, Nietzsche warns us to beware the tactful and the subtle, for they never forgive you if you catch them in an error. They never forget a stupidity or humiliation that they have suffered in front of you. It's only 3 sentences, so I'll read it to you now. 217. Beware of those who attach great value to being credited with moral tact and subtlety in making moral distinctions. They never forgive us once they have made a mistake in front of us, or worse, against us. Inevitably, they become our instinctive slanderers and detractors, even if they should still remain our friends. Blessed are the forgetful, for they get over their stupidities too. It's not hard to imagine that this passage may be referring to Wagner or one of Nietzsche's other friends with whom he's had a break prior to this time. In section 218, Nietzsche discusses the French psychological novelists of the bourgeois and proposes a new amusement, he says. Study the mediocre, the unconscious craftiness, he says, of mediocre lower spirits toward higher spirits. He says, in this study of humanity, you will find 1,000 times more subtle psychological distinctions at play than in the middle classes, so celebrated in the novels of the time. And I think it's worth noting here the attention that Nietzsche draws to the complex psychology of the low in their attitude toward the high in spirit. This will be important when we come to master morality and slave morality later in the book. This section ends with a kind of offensive injunction to the psychologists of the day. He says, vivisect the good man, the man of goodwill, vivisect yourselves. We remember vivisection here is the dissection of live specimens. Nietzsche is telling the psychologists of his day, the inferior psychologists, to turn their tools on themselves, to vivisect themselves, examine their own moralities, and how they have come to be. We might also ask ourselves if this act of self-vivisection is not, in fact, part of what Nietzsche is accomplishing here in this work and others. In section 219, Nietzsche identifies a tool that the spiritually stunted will use in this attack against those of higher spirit. It is moral judgment and condemnation. This is a kind of revenge, he says, and compensation for their own weakness. We should keep in mind here the concepts of ressentiment and slave morality, which we will discuss elsewhere. This he refers to as a kind of malice spiritualized. So here is the attitude of the low spirits towards the high spirits, of the mediocre towards the great. It's a kind of spiritual malice, a desire to destroy and pull down out of spite. The low, he says, take pleasure in finding a standard that the high will fail, or at least in which the high are their equals, because we all fail, we all are sinful. He says the most vigorous foes of atheism show this quality and fall into this camp. He ends this section with a kind of esoteric conspiracy talk. He notes that he will conceal his true purpose, or we might say present it in a kind of slant fashion. The truth is that high-spiritedness is incompatible with mere morality of his day, but, he says, people of this day will not want to hear this message, so what he'll say instead, by way of flattery, is that high-spiritedness is the synthesis of the moral qualities of mere morality. It is a kind of spiritualized justice. It is an order of rank among things. And there's clearly some irony here, since Nietzsche does intend to uphold the order of rank, but I think he's speaking conspiratorially to the reader about his intent to present this in such a way that it will be endorsed precisely by the people who are most vigorously his enemies. We'll hear a lot more about order of rank later in Part 7. Section 220 discusses the modern popularity of disinterestedness. We would associate this especially with Kant and Kantian morality. Nietzsche analyzes this label's use, and he notes that what high spirits and refined tastes prefer, the masses find to be uninteresting, and so they call the preference for it disinterested. We should note here that this central moral category of disinterested action, according to Nietzsche, results from a misunderstanding by the low of the preferences of the high. That is, it's not built into the rationality of the cosmos. It is simply that people with an inadequate sense of taste fail to understand why it is that certain elevated and high spirits have the preferences and drives that they have. The low, he says, puzzle over how high spirits can act without self-interest. And he says the truth is that disinterested action is exceedingly interested. Even action from love, he says, is interested. To sacrifice is to want something back. This is a psychological point that he's making. And he suggests at the end of this section that truth is somehow beyond this type of inquiry. It is too important, it's too subtle to answer the rabble's questions. In fact, he returns to his opening image of truth as a woman. He says even now, truth finds it necessary to stifle her yawns when she is expected to give answers. In the end, she is a woman, she should not be violated. So we have the sense of truth as lying beyond the sort of scrappy questions of the multitude in this regard. It's something more noble and elevated than this pedestrian type of philosophy can treat. Section 221 discusses the theme that morality is personal, and he argues against any kind of impersonal universalism in morals, thinking again here, obviously, of Kant. To impose an impersonal morality on everyone is a profound error. It depends a great deal in any particular situation on who the actor is and who the other person is. That is to say, the particular is always more important for this decision-making than any abstract universal. So, his example, a man who is made for command, in such a man modesty would be a vice. A quote from the middle of this section, which I think is quite revealing. Every unegoistic morality that takes itself for unconditional and addresses itself to all does not only sin against taste, it is a provocation to sins of omission, one more seduction under the mask of philanthropy, and precisely a seduction and injury for the higher, the rarer, the privileged. Moralities must be forced to bow, first of all, before the order of rank. So we have here Nietzsche's key idea that morality is ultimately a matter of taste, and that the imposition of a single universal morality on all will be not just an error, but a temptation, a seduction to powerful spirits. We might think here of a similar theme picked up by Dostoevsky around the same time. Note here as well that Nietzsche refers to moralities in the plural, that moralities must follow order of rank, so they must be appropriate for the rank of spiritual strength that the particular individual possesses. To try to impose a lower-ranking morality on a higher spirit or a higher-ranking morality on a lower spirit would be a profound error. In section 222, Nietzsche discusses the preaching of pity. Today, in Europe, he says, is a kind of preaching of self-contempt. It is part of the darkening and uglification of Europe that's been going on for some time. Or perhaps, he suggests, This self-contempt is in fact the cause of this uglification of the European personality. Modern man, he says, is dissatisfied with himself and therefore wants to suffer, but because of his vanity, he won't suffer alone. He wants to suffer with others. And this is the genesis of pity as a social phenomenon. A very interesting bit of psychological analysis from Nietzsche here. Section 223 discusses costumes, that it is the first of two sections on the historical sense. For the modern European, Nietzsche says, history is a closet for storing costumes. These costumes are moralities, tastes, articles of faith, religions, to be worn, changed, to be taken off, and to be studied, in preparation for what he calls a carnival in the grand style, perhaps. So think of a huge costume ball, a huge masquerade, and we moderns, modern Europeans of the 19th century, are all trying on and taking off and exchanging different costumes, different moralities, different codes. He says there may be some cause for optimism in this. Perhaps this is the sole remaining source of creativity in the modern world. If nothing else about us has a future, he says, perhaps our laughter has a future. This seems to me to be a very postmodern point, that history is no longer and can never be a source of tradition or even information, but is simply a storehouse to be mined for something new or interesting. And this prospect that only our laughter may have a future, maybe the only lasting thing about us, suggests, to me at least, that perhaps the ultimate sort of modern figure in this, along this line of thought, is the Joker. This brings us about 1/3 of the way through Part 7. I'll end here, and I'll talk in the next video about the middle part of Part 7, more about the historical sense, about the nature of suffering and cruelty. In section 224 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche discusses the historical sense in more detail. He calls it the capacity for quickly guessing the order of rank of the valuations according to which a people, a society, a human being has lived. So we can think of the historical sense as a kind of appreciation for the different moralities, the different moral codes that different peoples at different places and times have had. It is unique to the 19th century, Nietzsche says, and it follows from the semi-barbarism into which Europeans have slipped following a century or more of the mixing of nations and peoples and classes. This democratic spirit has brought about a state of humanity in which we have this historical sense. We are no longer noble peoples with their own codes, but we are, he says, we ourselves are a kind of chaos. We are, therefore, the recipients of the past in the way that no noble ages ever were. This historical sense seems to be something new in the modern age. This opens unique possibilities to us, however. In this moment, as modern people, we have access to all these semi-barbaric cultures of the past. Because nothing is ours, also nothing is off limits to us, so we can evaluate and appropriate elements of the past the way that noble cultures could not. Another way of putting it is that our ignoble age can have a taste for everything, unlike noble ages of the past. Each age, each noble class would have its own strongly defined sense of taste. It would accept or reject the foreign based upon what met its taste. We have no taste as modern people. Nietzsche lists some of our virtues, in keeping with the title of this part. We are, he says, unpretentious, selfless, modest, courageous, full of self-overcoming, full of devotion, very grateful, very patient, and very accommodating, but we do not have good taste. We cannot appreciate the fullness or the maturity of a past age's full self-realization. We might say we're not able to turn the dial all the way up to 100 for any particular past glorious age, but we make up for this in breadth. We have access to many different ages. For us, Nietzsche says, it is the infinite, the unmeasured, and the dangerous that drives our society and that drives our sense of self as moderns. In the next section, Nietzsche discusses the value of suffering, and he begins by listing some ethical isms, utilitarianism, and the like, which measure value in terms of pleasure and pain. Unfortunately, for them, pleasure and pain are secondary phenomena. Nietzsche says, we, I think meaning we philosophers of the future, we who are conscious of our creative power, look down on these considerations of pleasure and pain. And we have, he says, our own pity, but our pity is different from your pity, the pity of the utilitarians. It is not pity with society or pity with the unfortunate. It is not pity with the restless rabble longing to assert itself to remake society along democratic lines. Our pity, he says, is lighter and more far-sighted. It is pity for the self-imposed smallness of modern man. Still addressing the moderns and the utilitarians, Nietzsche says, we find your seriousness more dangerous than any frivolity. And why is this? It is because you want to abolish suffering, this monstrous goal of yours. Now, to you, we immoralists, we philosophers of the future, Nietzsche says, we seem to value suffering. We seem to want more suffering in the world. But it certainly is the case that we want no part of what you call well-being, regardless whether that is eudaimonistic or utilitarian in nature. So Nietzsche here praises the discipline of great suffering, and he does so in an expression that he will repeat almost verbatim at the beginning of Part 9 in section 257. He writes here, the discipline of suffering, of great suffering, do you not know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far? So the progress of the human race, of the type man, its elevation to greater spiritual heights, this does not come through the relief of suffering, this comes through the imposition of the discipline of suffering. We might think of this as a kind of internal tension within the soul or within even an entire society, like the tension contained in a bent bow, to use an image that we also see in Zarathustra's prologue. In the second half of section 225, Nietzsche uses a metaphor that I think is quite important for understanding 20th century existentialism. He says, in man, creature and creator are united. I think along these same lines, I think of a phrase that I remember from long ago from one of my teachers, that man is an artist and his greatest work of art is himself. So we are both creator and created. But Nietzsche uses this image to deepen the contrast between his pity and the pity of the utilitarians. He says, your pity is for the creature in man, for the part of man that must be broken, for the raw material, the thing that must be changed and must suffer. Our pity, he doesn't say outright, but implies, our pity is for the creator in man, for the creative self, for the one that is doing the breaking and remaking of a new self, a higher self. And this is the key element, I think, of Nietzsche's higher ethics, which is above considerations of pleasure and pain. I'll pass over the next two sections fairly quickly. In section 226, Nietzsche simply contrasts the work of we immoralists with the clumsy dolts who dwell on appearances in the modern world and contemporary society. And in section 227, he speaks about honesty, not for the first or last time, with a kind of ironic praise. He talks about our honesty, which he associates with our devilry, which he suggests we will put into opposition to the holiness of our opponents, to their godliness. And he talks about our disgust with what is clumsy and approximate, our adventurous courage, our seasoned and choosy curiosity, our subtlest, most disguised, most spiritual will to power and overcoming of the world. All of these I think we can add to the list of our virtues that he's compiling in this part. Section 228 opens by noting that all moral philosophy so far has been boring and soporific, and he specifically here is attacking the utilitarians. Nietzsche is in rare form here with his wit. He writes, "It is important that as few people as possible should think about morality. Hence it is very important that morality should not one day become interesting. But there is no reason for worry. In other words, the contemporary moral philosophers, the utilitarians, are in no danger of actually making morality into a topic of interest for the masses. Moral philosophy in Europe today is boring and safe. It lacks any sense of danger, and more importantly, it lacks any sense of calamity. We might think again here about the contrast with the madmen passage in The Gay Science, or Zarathustra's prologue, the sense of doom, the sense of moral catastrophe that is impending upon Europe. The utilitarians and other contemporary moral philosophers, Nietzsche says, seem to be more like technicians working on a machine, adjusting a nut or a belt here, trying to find small improvements in efficiency to improve the overall functioning of the machine. They have no idea that the machine itself is shortly to be destroyed. He connects this as well, I think, with what we might call the English assumption that all virtue, always and everywhere, has always been about people striving for English-style comfort, for, a warm hearth and a full cellar and a barrel of beer. And this is enough comfort for anyone. What more could anyone possibly want? Nietzsche says these moral philosophers cannot imagine that what is good for one is not good for all. What's good for one person is not good for all people. What's good for one nation or class may not be good for all nations and classes. They miss the fact that there is an order of rank between men and between moralities. Another iteration of this key element in Nietzsche's thought of the order of rank. In the next section, Nietzsche praises cruelty. He says almost anything that we call higher culture is based on the spiritualization of cruelty. In art, both the tragic and the sublime depend upon some element of cruelty. But it is an error of modern psychologists to assume that cruelty involves enjoying only the suffering of others. Cruelty, he says, is possible in enjoying one's own suffering. I think we can connect this to the idea of creator and created in a previous section, that there is a sense in which spiritual and moral progress even requires the self-discipline of being cruel and hard with oneself. And so I want to emphasize this praise of cruelty, I think, is praise of an inward-directed cruelty primarily. Even the seeker after knowledge, Nietzsche says, must work against the inclination of his spirit. His spirit would rather remain ignorant, would rather remain self-indulgent. In a sense, we have to force ourselves to seek knowledge, to find what is there. In all desire to know, he writes, there is a drop of cruelty. In section 230, the last section I'll talk about in this video, Nietzsche takes up and explains further a concept he introduced at the end of the previous section, this idea of the will of the spirit. I think what he is getting at here are different elements of the will to power, different kinds of drives or will within a single individual, within a single culture or society. There is first, and maybe primary, the will to mastery of one's environment, the will to be master in one's own house, he says, and most especially to feel oneself to be master. This is the sort of domineering drive that is part of the life force of all living things. He calls it the will to simplify. In order to incorporate the foreign into itself, then the self will sometimes falsify or will sort of separate out and be selective about what it incorporates. It will disregard what is uncongenial to it. This is the part of the will of the spirit that values growth and especially the feeling of growth, the sort of waxing of the self. There is an opposite drive to this, however. This is the will to exclude, the will to shut oneself off, to be defensive, the will even to embrace ignorance. Nietzsche connects this also with a kind of digestion. This seems to be proportional to the previous will. There's a will to mastery, which incorporates, and a will to exclusion, which incorporates and digests. And it's here in this latter drive that we find the occasional will of the spirit to let itself be deceived, to allow ourselves to go along with a story that we know is not in fact so. Also here we find the spirit of dissimulation, the willingness to deceive others. This is the part of the self, the drive within the self that enjoys wearing masks, and that constitutes our creative power. It is, we might say, the will to mere appearance, the will to simplification, to the wearing of masks, to dwelling upon the surface, as opposed to the will to truth, the will to profundity, to multiplicity, to thoroughness, and this is associated with the cruelty that was mentioned earlier. Nietzsche then returns here to the idea that the knowledge seeker requires above all a kind of self-discipline. He says, it would sound nicer for us if we were to call this cruelty honesty, but, he says, we free spirits, we philosophers of the future, don't need this kind of verbal pomp. We don't need to dress up our inner cruelty in the language of this virtue. In the penultimate paragraph of this part, Nietzsche gives us, I think, an interesting indication of where he's going with the rest of the book. So I'd like to share that with you right now, and here it is. To translate man back into nature, to become master over the many vain and overly enthusiastic interpretations and connotations that have so far been scrawled and painted over that eternal basic text of Homo Natura, to see to it that man henceforth stands before man as even today, hardened in the discipline of science, he stands before the rest of nature, with intrepid Oedipus eyes and sealed Odysseus ears, deaf to the siren songs of old metaphysical bird-catchers who have been piping at him all too long. You are more, you are higher, you are of a different origin. That may be a strange and insane task, but it is a task. Who would deny that? Why did we choose this insane task? Or putting it differently, why have knowledge at all? Nietzsche here is talking about man's mastery over man and his self-understanding. He's comparing it to the superiority man already feels to nature, suggesting that man will shortly have this superiority with respect to himself. There's the troubling mention of Oedipus' eyes, suggesting a kind of violence and blindness, but also of sealed Odysseus' ears, stopping up our ears against the siren song of the metaphysicians who would say, man is higher, man is better than the natural world, than the animal world from which he comes. And Nietzsche calls this task strange and insane, and suggests this really is where he is going with the rest of the book, with the rest of this project. Why have knowledge at all? He says in the final paragraph, then, everybody will ask us that, and we, pressed this way, we who have put the same question to ourselves 100 times, we have found and find no better answer. ... He leaves that off, and so that's for the remainder of the book. But an indication here, I think, at the end of section 230, of just what Nietzsche is up to at this point in the text. In the final one-third of Part 7, Nietzsche gives his thoughts on women. I think this section breaks up the flow of the book, and it is an unfortunate mix of ranting, self-revelation, score-settling, and psychological observation. I think these sections could be skipped with relatively little loss. Following is my summary of what I found noteworthy in these parts. In section 231, Nietzsche begins by noting that there is something unteachable deep in each of us, and this includes our beliefs about men and women. We can only rediscover periodically how it is with us, what some people might call our convictions. Nietzsche says he will allow himself now to state some truths about women, but emphasizing that these are only his truths. This is a very personal revelation. A sampling of what follows, then, Nietzsche says women want to be self-reliant, but this is very bad for European culture. Truth, he says, is alien and repugnant to woman, who is all about appearances. When dealing with issues of profundity or justice, woman despises woman. And emancipated women like George Sand are not examples of female emancipation, but comical figures, more of a counter-argument against emancipation, he says. He gives in section 237 a brief epigram about a woman wearing a black dress and keeping a silent part. I think this is a covert dig at Lou Salome, with whom he had already broken by this point. He says to dream of sexual equality, of finally solving the sexual problem between men and women, This is a sign of weakness, of shallowness in the instincts, and anyone who goes wrong here on this issue is not to be trusted on other questions. Nietzsche recommends the Oriental attitude toward women, to treat them as property or as possessions. I think at this point in the section he is being as obnoxious and offensive as possible, perhaps knowing that this work will be read by Lou Salome. The final section of Book 7 is section 239. It's a long section and has some worthwhile insights and ideas in it. Nietzsche notes that the democratic spirit of modern Europe has increased men's respect for women, which women have immediately begun to abuse. They find it insulting and condescending. Women, he says, thereby lose their modesty, their sense of taste, and they begin to unlearn their fear of men, which is, he says, a loss of their womanly instincts. When men decline in fear-inspiring virtue, and that certainly is the case with modern man, women degenerate along with them. A quote from section 239, "Wherever the industrial spirit has triumphed over the military and aristocratic spirit, woman now aspires to the economic and legal self-reliance of a clerk." Since the French Revolution, Nietzsche says, women's influence over European culture has declined as their rights and claims have increased. And this emancipation of women, he says, is the result of or contains a stupidity, an almost masculine stupidity, he says. This defeminization of women, which he denounces, involves the surrender of the strongest ground on which to contend with men and their strongest weapons in that conflict. He writes, "To be sure, there are enough imbecilic friends and corrupters of woman among the scholarly asses of the male sex who advise woman to defeminize herself in this way and to imitate all the stupidities which man in Europe, European manliness, is sick." He goes on to suggest that women and piety are closely connected, that a woman without piety would seem obnoxious and ridiculous to a profound and godless man. It seems that even atheist men would like their women to be believers. There seems to be some connection in Nietzsche's mind here. The purpose of women, Nietzsche says, is to give birth to strong children. Again, I think he's being as deliberately and explicitly offensive as possible. Culture in women, he says, leads to a weakness of the will. It divides their strength of will. And he compares modern women unfavorably to Napoleon's mother, who he thinks exercised this feminine will to power most effectively. Woman's greatest asset with regard to men, Nietzsche says, is her nature, which is different from men's nature and inspires men's respect and fear and perhaps a bit of awe. He speaks then at the conclusion of this section of the slowly dawning borification of modern woman. Woman is becoming boring. She is becoming more like man, and since modern European man is degenerate and weak, she is coming to share in all of those vices. This brings us to the end of Part 7 of Beyond Good and Evil. We'll look at Part 8 next. Part 8 of Beyond Good and Evil is titled Peoples and Fatherlands. It runs about 25 pages from sections 240 to 256. Nietzsche opens and closes this part with observations on Wagner and his music. In between, he discusses the characteristics of Europeans, Germans, Jews, the English, and the French. He begins by reminiscing about Wagner's music, its strengths and weaknesses. In it there is something German in the best and worst senses of the word, both young and old, elegant and barbarous. Like Wagner's music, the German spirit is of the past and of the future, but has no present. Nietzsche's remarks on Europeans include a dialogue about whether Bismarck is a great leader for forcing political greatness on the reluctant German peoples. The lesson Nietzsche draws from it is that the spiritual flattening or shallowing of one people often leads to the deepening of another. So the spiritual decline of Bismarck's Reich might be met by greater spiritual energy in France. Modern Europeans are undergoing a physiological evolution, becoming more alike, more generic. A supranational and nomadic type of man is rising, adaptable above all else, but unrooted. This turn may have unexpected results, for the same conditions that produce herd men also produce rare, exceptional spirits. In short, democratization breeds tyrants, spiritually as well as politically. Next, Nietzsche proposes a vivisection of the German soul to uncover the sources of their supposed profundity. The German soul is complex, manifold, product of a mixture of races. It is full of spiritual caverns, hideouts, and dungeons. It is not quite right to say the German is, rather he develops. He is full of puzzles and contradictions. Hegel saw this. And yet, German profundity, even when ridiculous, is preferable to Prussian daring. German music, since Schumann, has been in danger of losing its European voice, of lapsing into mere fatherlandishness. In language and rhetoric, modern Germans have lost their feel for the rhythms of speech. German books are clumsy and dull. In section 246, Nietzsche makes these points while showing off his skills as a prose stylist. Kaufmann notes the difficulties of translating him here. Perhaps surprisingly, Nietzsche tells us that the only Germans who know how to speak with attention to language and rhythm are the preachers. It is worth remembering that Nietzsche's father was a Lutheran pastor who died when he was 4 years old. The real masterpiece of German prose is Luther's translation of the Bible. It seems that in both music and linguistic style, modern Germans are in a long decline. Given Nietzsche's association in the popular mind with Nazism and brutality, we might also be surprised by some of his observations about the Jews. He begins by distinguishing two types of genius in a people: active masculine and passive feminine. The former we associate with virility, the latter with pregnancy and its problems. Nietzsche puts the French and the ancient Greeks in the feminine, bringing forth group. In the masculine, begetting group, he places the Romans, the Germans, and the Jews. This is an unusual inversion of his time's scholarship, which held the Greeks to be creative and active, and of popular prejudice, which held the Jews to be passive and culturally parasitical. We might remember that 1886, the year this book was published, was also the year Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth moved to South America with her anti-Semite husband to found a racially pure Aryan colony. Some of Nietzsche's attacks on anti-Semites here clearly have in mind his sister and brother-in-law and their followers. The rest of his remarks on the Jews are generally positive. Europe inherits from the Jews the grand style in morality, something for which artists and great spirits are grateful. The Jews, however, are beyond any doubt the strongest, toughest, and purest race now living in Europe. They know how to prevail even under the worst conditions. They prevail through their virtues, most especially a rejection of, and lack of shame before, modern ideas. Like the Russians, the Jews change only when necessary, and then very slowly. For this reason, Nietzsche thinks the Russians and the Jews may be key to the European future. Modern European nations are artificial and unreal. He suggests expelling the anti-Semites and integrating and accommodating the Jews for the good of Germany and of Europe. At the end of section 251, he announces what he calls the European problem, the cultivation of a new caste that will rule Europe. Nietzsche then briefly considers the national characters of the English and the French. The English are a non-philosophical people, lacking spiritual profundity. The German spirit fights against English mechanistic doltification. The German word is Weltvertölpelung, literally world duping. This shallowness explains why the English cling to Christianity. They have not yet outgrown it. Nietzsche also disdains the domination of English midwit ideas, naming specifically Darwin, Mill, and Spencer. And he points out a crucial methodological difference. The empirical habit of poring over collections of small facts looking for patterns is ill-suited to spirits of a high type that soar on their own paths. Most modern ideas are of English origin, and this is a trend the German spirit fights. Nietzsche praises French spirit and culture, especially as they ignore the democratic bourgeois crowd. The French have the will to resist spiritual Germanization, but not the ability. As a result, it seems modern France may be the new home of Schopenhauerian pessimism. He praises three things in particular about the French: their artistic passion, their old moralistic culture manifested in a widespread curiosity not shared by Germans or Englishmen, and their synthesis of North and South European cultures, especially by contrast with the Germans, who are too northern. This France presents a better possibility for accommodating the rare high spirits who are not at home with modern German fatherlandishness. In the final two sections of Part 8, Nietzsche returns to German music and to Wagner, who had died 3 years previously. As expected, we see him distinguish his work from Wagner's, first with an emphasis on his, Nietzsche's, attachment to Southern Europe and Mediterranean culture as a remedy for the corrupting influence of Northern German music. Nietzsche groups Wagner ultimately with the Romantics, with those who transcend reason in feeling but who are ultimately just successful plebeians without noble spirit, antinomians and rebels against custom, who finally, exhausted, break and embrace Christianity. Nietzsche ends by suggesting that Wagner in his final years was on a path toward Catholicism, presenting Rome's faith without the text. That brings us to the end of Part 8 of Beyond Good and Evil. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.